This is the recorded lecture for October 5th for Ornithology, Biology 206. Our agenda for today is the New World sparrows and the cardinals and their allies. Those will be the two types of birds covered in this recorded lecture. The New World sparrows are the order Passeriformes, family Emberidae. These are birds you are very familiar with. They are small to medium-sized songbirds. Their coloration tends to be brown for the most part. They do have streaked appearances as well as round wings. Their bills are conical shaped. You can see that from the picture here. And that conical shaped bill is really perfect for eating seeds in the winter because it allows them to remove the husk or that outer covering off of the seed easily. Their habitats tend to include shrubs, deserts, grasslands, pine forests, and for most of us, our front and backyards. These birds have adapted, some of them, very, very well to living in human areas and human-based habitats. In fact, later this semester, we will see a video that includes some sparrows that have done so well in human habitats that they have learned how to operate the automatic doors into grocery stores and convenience stores that rely not on you walking across the mat in front of the door, but that the camera above the door sees you. And the birds will fly up to it, let it see them, have the doors open, and they're able to go in and feed in a grocery store. It's pretty impressive what these birds are able to do. And depending upon the store and the size of the store, sometimes sparrows are even capable of nesting inside of stores. There are a lot of different types of sparrows. You've probably already realized this, but you may not have quite realized how broad the sparrow category is. Just of the New World sparrows, there's between 319 to 321 different species in 72 genera, and this is just the New World ones. The New World sparrows include both sparrows and buntings, depending upon their naming convention. At one point in time, they were lumped in with the Fringillidae, which are the finches and some of the other birds. And because of that, there are some sparrows that are still referred to as finches, based on that old classification. We find that the sparrows are separated from the other New World 9 primaried oscines. 9 primary, dealing with how many feathers they have that are primary flight feathers, so they have 9, and oscines dealing with song learning. What separates them from the rest of these 9 primary New World oscines is their drab brown color and their conical bills. These birds are primarily a Western Hemisphere family. They're closest to the cardinals, actually, in classification and understanding their evolutionary relationship. And when you're trying to figure out exactly what a sparrow is, especially if you have no idea, it's going to be probably in your best interest to try and narrow it down to the genera and then try to determine the correct species from there. And we are going to look at a number of the different types of genera of our sparrows. Our first genus is the genus Pipilo. These include the towhees. They are the largest of the New World sparrows, and towhees would be the common name that's associated with most of the birds in this genus. Their characteristics include stout bills, long tails compared to the body size. So if you see a sparrow-like bird with a long tail, this might be a good place to start. And their wings are rounded like we see in most sparrows. They do have more distinct colors and obvious colorful plumages compared to a lot of the other sparrows. You can see from the example on this slide that it has that orange coloration as well as white and black. And if you look closely, you'll see that the eye of this bird is also colorful. Those are the types of pieces of information you would want to make an identification of a bird like this. You also probably noted that it has some white markings on its wings and looks like it might be a white underside to the tail, but that could also be the snow in the picture, kind of getting in our way. These birds tend to be found in edge habitats, meaning the edge of a forest or the edge of a shrubland and a grassland next to something else, or in shrub habitats. Shrubs are going to be your smaller woody plants. These birds are not likely to be found in very mature forests unless you're right at the edge, because they tend to thrive in these edge habitat areas. Their preferred form of foraging, other than flying around and eating off of potentially plants, is double scratch foraging, which we'll get to in a number of slides. You'll see a picture of exactly what that looks like. And as soon as it's explained, you'll realize that you've seen this happen many, 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 many times. The birds that fall into genus Pipilo tend to be rather solitary. They do join mixed species feeding flocks as flocks are moving through their territories though. Next is the genus Spicella. These are small songbird sparrows that are found throughout North America. You may be familiar with the one on the screen right now. Some of you may have actually seen this bird already. This genus can be found ranging from the Arctic tundra through the desert scrublands of Mexico. So they're found primarily in the northern hemisphere of the western hemisphere. They can live well in human adapted and human associated areas. And unlike the last group, in the winter they form single species flocks, and they tend to roam fields or grasslands looking for food. So these are not going to be as equally found throughout human associated areas as some of the others. Doesn't mean they won't be found there at all. It just means that that on average this genus is less likely to be located there. Next is genus Amissivisa. These are arid habitat sparrows. An arid habitat is a dry habitat, so you're going to think about an area that does not get much rain. This could be a desert or the Pampas or something like that type of location. Depending on taxonomy, we either have 2 or up to 4 species of this group. That's where we get that 319 to 321 different species of these sparrows. It depends on your field guide. The sage sparrow can be split into the sage and bells sparrows as separate species. Not everyone does that, and I don't think that there's quite a definitive answer yet on whether or not it should be split. And the 5-striped sparrow is sometimes included as part of this genus, but other times it is placed in Emeophila because its body shape and structure and bill structure better fit that group than this one. These birds tend to be gray in coloration. If you look at the one on the screen, you will see in fact that nice gray color overtoned to the brown. They have long tails, medium-sized bills, and that gray color can be a pretty clear indication that maybe this is what you're seeing, but there are lots of other birds that are sparrows that are gray that do not fit into this genus. The genre Amiodramus and Passerculis are our next ones. The Amiodramus have 7 species that fall into that. They have short tails, flat heads, round wings, and large bills. The birds in this group actually will kind of do some pretty interesting things in that when a birder or bird watcher is walking almost entirely on top of them, they will suddenly fly up. They'll flush out of the bush very, very quickly, and they will fly a little distance and settle back into the grass. The Passerculis is the savanna sparrow only. It is the only one of its genus. It has a shorter tail and longer wings than Amiodramus, but we believe it is likely related to them. The savanna sparrow, when it is flushed from an area, will go to an area close by as well, much like the Amiodramus do. But as opposed to waiting until the threat is almost on top of them like the Amiodramus, species will. The savanna sparrow will fly pretty quickly away as soon as it senses that disturbance. So it has a different type of startle response based on the distance of the potential threat to it. Some of you have seen a savanna sparrow, I believe. Some of you may still get to see one. The Ammodramus and savanna sparrows tend to prefer open grassland habitats. They make very interesting vocalizations. They sound almost insect-like, sometimes grasshopper-like, sometimes with other insect-like noises. And because these birds have their own type of flushing behavior when a potential predator is nearby, they are somewhat difficult to get to move. If you were to walk up to them making the pishing noise, they might not move when you want them to. And because of that, and the fact that they will fly right up and then randomly go off into a different pattern, they may be difficult to follow. Unlike a lot of birds where you'll be able to flush them out easily and see where they go, these are going to flush, wait, flush to a new position, and you may not be able to identify them easily because of their flushing behavior. The next group is the genre Melaspiza and Passerella. These include medium-sized long-tailed sparrows. The habitats are shrubs, forests, and wetland edges. So much like the first group we talked about, the pipalo, these prefer edge areas. The song sparrow is included in the Melaspiza group. This is a bird I think everyone has seen. You see a picture of it here as the top picture. There are 31 subspecies of song sparrow. 31 subspecies. All are still considered part of the species for song sparrow. And not surprisingly, this bird is one of the best studied bird species in the world. Think about that for a moment. Song sparrows are pretty ubiquitous across North America. It makes sense that they would in fact be one of the best studied bird species. They also do well in edge habitat, and as we have developed and spread across the United States, Canada, even Mexico, these are birds that have done very well in human-dominated environments. They're used to humans, so they're not as likely to startle and flee as some of the other species, so these are one of our better studied bird species. They live well near us, they're doing well in our habitats, we see them all the time, so it's easy for us to study them. The fox sparrow is in the Passerella genus currently, and there is question about whether or not the fox sparrow is a singular sparrow species or if it should be split into potentially up to 4 different species, which would change that count of total number of species just a little bit more. The genus Zonotrichia includes 4 species. They're found in shrub areas and woodland edges. These include some of the larger of the emberizid or the sparrow species. The white-throated sparrows and the white-crowned sparrows are a part of this group. And I know some of you, if not all of you, have seen at least one of these 2 species. These will become more common in this area during the winter time. We should likely get to see them on a few of our other trips. And they are very common in those mixed species feeding flocks in the winter. So they will join with other sparrows, with chickadees, with titmice, with nuthatches, with creepers. All sorts of things can be found feeding together. These birds can be attracted to the bird feeders at your house, but they don't tend to use elevated feeders as much as they're going to use those that are on the ground or those that are attached to something, and on the ground feeding is definitely better for them. And they prefer to forage in areas where they're close to cover. So if you happen to have an area in your backyard with some trees that you could put a bird feeder on the ground, you're more likely to attract these birds than you would be a bird feeder 20 feet away from the trees standing up on a post. So think about that. The placement of your bird feeder will determine what types of birds you attract to it. The genus Junco contains the juncos, the dark-eyed junco, which many of you have seen. They are gray birds in this grouping, and you can see from the picture here that they may be very gray. They are medium-sized sparrows. They tend to have white outer tail feathers and white bellies. And they are gray, but sometimes that gray is more clay colored. Sometimes it's more blue gray, sometimes it's more black gray. There are two species, the dark-eyed junco and the yellow-eyed junco. I doubt any of you will see a yellow-eyed junco this semester. They live only in Mexico and Arizona. But the dark-eyed junco is a pretty familiar winter resident in North America and in this area. It is both migratory through here and it may overwinter through this area. These birds are called snowbirds in some areas because they appear with the snow and winter in areas. So some areas only see them during wintering time. The last genre that we're going to talk about are calcareous and Platyphrenics. This includes the long spurs and the snow buntings. These groups do have very distinctive color patterns, so they are going to be different from the rest of the sparrows because of this. They also have long wings and short tails, which is the opposite of most of the groups that we've seen so far. If you look at the snow bunting at the bottom of this picture, or at the bottom of this slide, you'll actually be able to see that the tail here is much shorter than you've seen with some of the other sparrows. They do tend to have a pudgy appearance to them as opposed to most of the other sparrows. The calcareous flocks can number into the hundreds of individuals. And what's very interesting about them is that if they are flushed from an area, if they sense a predator and they all fly away, they do not necessarily tend to flush far. They may only move a short distance and then resettle down, allowing you, the birder, to hopefully be able to identify them if you do manage to startle them. The snow bunting and Mackay's bunting readily hybridize in nature, and because of this, there's a question about whether or not they are separate species or if they are more subspecies, and should they be combined into a singular species in bird guides. A lot of what we use to determine species is based on whether or not things are reproducing together. And since these are reproducing together, the case could potentially be made that they should be a singular species. The birds in this grouping, the snow buntings, are found in large flocks in open areas during the winter. Sparrow plumage, I've mentioned at the beginning, is mostly dark brown in coloration. And they are generally brown. We did see that a few of these tend to be gray, especially the juncos. And a couple groups of sparrows tend to have gray tones to them. But they frequently have streaks or different colorations on the breast and the back. And you can see the sparrow compared to some other birds at the top of this picture. The sparrow does have pretty distinctive features to it. The rose-breasted grosbeak, summer tanager, Louisiana water thrush, and Bullock's oriole are not in fact sparrows. There is just that savanna sparrow in that top picture. Males and females often do not have sexual dimorphism in this group. There are a few species that do have some different patterns, different colorations between males and females, but even then they tend to be very subtle. The majority of species have streaks or stripes of colors on the breast and on the stomach. And that's not always seen in every species, but it's seen in almost all of the juveniles of this group, even if the adults do not keep the streaking as they age. The white-throated sparrow, as you can see on the bottom of this slide, has two genetic plumage polymorphisms. They have a tan striped and a white striped variation. They aren't really subspecies, and they do tend to interbreed. It just appears that there is a difference in coloration between what the color of their stripe is going to look like. And they are equally capable of mating with a tan or a white striped variety. Sparrows well, you all probably could have told me exactly where they're found, tend to have a variety of habitats. They do live in deserts. They live in our backyards, they live in open areas, they live on forest edges, they live on wetland edges. They can be found in grass and shrub-dominated habitats very often. They are very widespread in their distribution and seem to thrive everywhere that they're found. With human beings developing land, they've actually gained considerable amounts of habitat. Very few species of sparrows are found in mature, closed canopy forests. So these large forests that are beloved by so many other types of bird species are actually not where sparrows are going to live. They may be found in successional woodlands or along the forest edges, but forested areas are not going to be their main place to find habitat or food. For them, habitat quality is going to be best defined by a combination of characteristics: foraging resources, refuge from predators, and breeding. Well, what would they want for foraging? They eat insects that are found in soil and in leaf litter and on low vegetation during the summer. And in the winter, their main food source is seeds. So they need a location with lots of readily available seeds and insects that they can easily get to. So they're going to prefer different types of soil than will birds that are not eating from the ground surface. When they're looking for refuge from predators, their main concerns are hawks that hunt birds and mammals. So they're going to prefer shrubs and deep grasses where they can easily hide, places where they can fly up when they're flushed out and then settle someplace else equally unlikely to be seen. They will flee when they feel threatened. And there have been a few incidences where we've discovered sparrows who could not flee by flying have actually run into mouse or other types of rodent burrows and hid underground to hide from their predator. So that is another reason why living in these edge areas is good for them. Perhaps they've taken advantage of the other types of hiding places that those locations offer. For breeding locations, they tend to prefer small shrubs. Sometimes they'll nest in a shrub. Other times they'll nest on the ground at the base of a shrub or in a large clump of grass. They will nest absolutely in birdhouses if you put them out. And what is interesting is that these species will use a variety of different nesting sites. There's no species that has only one type of nesting location that is perfect for it. They are willing to find the best nest site available in their habitat. For foraging, one thing that makes these birds very nice for us to understand is they all have a conical bill. So there will be some overall similarities in the group because of this conical bill, but the shape of the bill that each type has does differ. During the breeding season, the birds are going to tend to specialize on eating insects and other types of invertebrates. You can see here we have a male sparrow feeding either a female sparrow or a young juvenile sparrow a mealworm. And in that picture, we are looking at a house sparrow. House sparrow is one of the groups where there is a difference between the male and the female plumage. The males have that black kind of band around the eyes as well as the black bib, whereas the females do not have that coloration. And during the breeding season, when they are eating insects and invertebrates, these birds are making sure that they are stocking up their protein reserves. You may find that there will be lots of sparrows living in the same area, lots of different species utilizing the same exact habitat. And that is very possible because different species in the same area are going to focus on potentially slightly different parts of a very similar diet. They may be eating all the same thing, or it could be that some are eating mealworms, whereas others are eating ants or other types of insect prey. During the season when they are not breeding, these birds are going to eat a lot of seeds. And during that time, they will actually be specializing on certain seed types. so to allow lots of species to utilize the same area while specializing on their seed type. With insects, they may eat a large variety of them and they may all overlap on the same species of insects. But with seeds, there tends to be much more specialization. This is because that bill shape is going to make them great at husking some seeds and not as good at husking others. When the parents are feeding their nestlings, so they're young birds that are still in the nest, they will feed them a variety of animal or insect food supplies. The caterpillars or other types of soft-bodied insects are easily fed to the offspring. However, grasshoppers and things with large appendages are a lot harder to eat. So the parents will actually prepare things like a grasshopper for their offspring by removing the legs, the antennas, the wings, and feeding them just the softer parts of the large insects. As nestlings grow, the type of food and the size of food that they are given is going to increase because they're able to eat more and because they're able to process food better. During the non-breeding season, as the sparrows choose their food, they will choose the types of seeds that they are capable of cracking easily, and those where they can remove the outer husk with the bill shape that they have. And we find that in the winter season, they will choose habitats based on the type of seed that is available to them there. And if you were wondering, it is true that for the most part, sparrows with small bills are going to eat smaller seeds, and those with larger bills are going to focus on eating larger seeds. It just seems to be that that is what is a better fit for the bill structure that they have. When sparrows are foraging, they will use a variety of different types of behaviors. One is that they will just literally pick up food items from the ground, pluck them off the vegetation, and consume them. It's pretty easy. Double scratch is our next slide, and I'll talk about it when we get there. Another that they're able to do is kick vegetation in deep leaf litter. You've probably seen birds do this, where they're going through a forested area or across a path, and they will just kick at it with their feet. They're not mad at the leaves. In fact, what they're doing is hoping by kicking the leaves, they will uncover some insects, or they will shake seeds or something else free from them. So by moving the leaves, what they're doing is trying to find prey items without having to actually physically pick up and move each leaf. Just by kicking it, they might be able to pry something loose. They will eat from bird feeders, and they adore bird feeders in the winter. Suet with nuts is perfect, as are just plain bird seeds waiting for them. You can see from this image that sparrows love bird seed. They will come and they will eat from your house constantly. And if they know that you provide them with bird seed and also have places nearby for nesting opportunities, you will never find your yard free of sparrows. Sparrows can also climb low vegetation, and they can directly pluck food items like seeds, maybe even berries, from some of the larger species, from the plants themselves. They will also search the ground and spider webs to try and find invertebrates and insects to eat. And they will remove them from the spider web or the ground should they find them. They will also ride on grass stems. These pictures show the double scratch behavior at the top and the riding on grass stem behavior at the bottom. The double scratch is quite literally what it sounds like. They take both of their claws together and they claw across the ground, pushing leaf litter around the surface and digging into the upper soil. And when they do the double scratch, they are scratching at the leaf litter or the soil using both feet at the same exact time. Scratching with both feet at the same time on the ground surface allows them to dig through leaf litter, to dig through soil, to hopefully allow themselves to expose some type of invertebrate prey item, or maybe even a seed that they couldn't find before. Sometimes they will employ this along with kicking the leaf litter, using both together to actually clear an area faster. The other picture includes that of a junco riding a grass stem. So the plant was upright when the bird kind of landed on it. What the bird did is use its weight to kind of bring that seed-rich portion of the grass stem down to the ground surface. Now that it has brought that down to the ground surface, it uses its body and gravity as leverage to remove the seeds and strip them of their husks on the plant. Sparrows do have a number of different types of adaptations to their anatomy and physiology. Their bill and foot morphology are directly related to how they forage. So the bill is conical shaped because it is used for stripping seeds from their husks. Their feet are perfect for the double scratch behavior. So whether or not the behaviors are the result of the anatomy or if the anatomy results from selective pressure based on behavior, they are well adapted for their foraging styles. And because sparrows will shift from insect food to plant-based foods, we find that they are one of the groups where their digestive tract length changes depending upon the season. So as their diet shifts seasonally, their gut morphology is going to change slightly, but their bodies are capable of handling very different types of food supplies. Some species have this very strange thing in the sparrows, where they have a shorter bill during the summer than they have during the winter. And we don't believe that it's in fact that the winter changes and the weather gets colder and they grow a longer beak. We think what happens is that they appear to have a longer beak in the winter and appear to have a shorter one at the beginning of the summer because they spend all winter eating seeds and grit. And if you're eating a lot of rough materials, it's going to break down the bill structure. So that bill may be kind of worn down by the time summer starts. When you get to the end of summer and the end of fall and winter starts beginning, they've been eating a lot of insect-rich material. That has allowed the bill to kind of regrow, and it now looks larger because in fact they've been eating soft insect material all summer, and the bill was not worn down by that. So it's not that they have a different length of bill, that they choose to have a different length of bill in the summer versus the winter. It is the result of the type of diet that they are eating. They also have behavioral adaptations that allow them to live the life that these sparrows have. We believe that the types of habitats that they live in and the type of feeding that they do are related to the fact that they live in environments that are very patchy in food distribution. Think about an edge habitat for a moment. When you move from one place to 10 feet away from it, and then another 20 feet beyond that, there are different plants, there's different vegetation, there's different amounts of coverage, potentially even different insects. So these habitat edges are patchy in location, but also patchy in what they contain. And they're also rather unpredictable when it comes to distribution of food. There may be a lot in some areas and maybe not as much on another area of edge. So because of that, these birds have taken advantage of living in an area where others are not thriving, but also in an area where they may be having to live close together and almost on top of each other. And we know that in areas where food is difficult to find, these birds become vulnerable to predators. So the reason they have perhaps picked the edge is that the edge allows them to be close enough to the food away from the edge, where they're out in the open, but living near the edge allows them to return quickly for cover. And refuge cover is something that these birds are going to look for. They're going to pick a habitat that has a place where they can hide. That means that if you have a whole flock of sparrows in a field and there's only one bush to hide in, if a predator comes, they're all going to hide in that bush. They may fly a little further away if they can get someplace else, but a whole lot of them are going to fly to that one location to hide. Because of this, perhaps, these birds have developed a flocking behavior, and many of them forage in flocks during the winter. What helps is that means there are many eyes. There are many birds that could potentially see a predator risk. So while you may not be safe
because your group is obvious to a predator, you may in fact be safe inside the group because it means that you're likely to know that the predator is there. There is this idea, once the birds that formed groups are trying to balance the size of the group with how large of a group is going to attract a predator. Because the birds that are in a group are, sure, less likely to be eaten up to a certain point, and then at a certain group size, the group is likely to be attacked by a predator simply because it's so large that they're likely to get one. But with a flock of birds like the one in this picture here, they're looking all over the place all the time. Some of them are going to be acting as sentries while others are eating, and they'll switch off. So because of that, they are likely to see a predator. And we know that within these flocks, there is a dominance hierarchy. We have discovered this by watching these birds and looking at their behaviors. The older males and those with the largest body size tend to be the most dominant among the group. And what does that mean? Well, the dominant birds have the first pick of all the food. And if a dominant bird shows up to a bird that is subordinate to it, and then makes it clear that it wants the food item the subordinate is eating, the subordinate will have to give up the food to the dominant bird. These subordinates will fly away, generally last, and return first after they've been flushed from an area. So they've been stirred by a predator, they leave last, and they return first. This puts the subordinates at a higher risk than it does the dominant birds, but the belief is that the dominant birds also have the better genetics of those in the group. Therefore, protecting them is important for protecting the group in and of itself. Sparrows tend to form monogamous pairs when they are breeding, and it does take both parents to raise a full nest of sparrow offspring, so it is good that they are in monogamous pairs. They will defend their summer territory from other birds, mainly their nest site, and a lot of their defense is that of males singing songs at other birds or yelling at them. So most of the defense is vocalized based. And this type of monogamous pairs defending summer territory, which is an area where they forage and raise their young, is pretty typical of most of our songbirds. And like most of those birds, the females build the nest, do the majority of incubation. However, both the male and the female will split feeding the young. And sometimes they may have 2 broods per year. And when that happens, it may be that the male will take over the responsibilities of feeding and showing their older brood how to find food on their own, while the female is laying the eggs and doing the incubation of their second set of offspring. So they are capable of splitting the duties of the brood between both parents. There are a few sparrow species that do not follow this monogamy. Some are polygynous, some are bigamous, and some are polygynandrous. So in polygamy, there are multiple females. In a bigamous group, there are 2 females. And then in a group that is polygynandrous, there are multiples of each sex that are mating with multiples of each. And they are in some sort of a cooperative group where the females are mating with the males in the groups and the males are mating with the females in the group. It makes things a bit complicated in determining who in fact are the parents of a specific egg, but it does seem to work for them. And one of the things that we've discovered in our studies on sparrows is that while they seem to be monogamous, extra pair copulations are common. An extra pair copulation is when a male or a female will mate with a male or female that is not in fact their monogamous pair. So if you have pair A of birds, the male from that may mate with the female from pair B living in the same area. They are not a cooperative group that mates with each other, but they will, in fact, go off and have a quick extra pair copulation, or if you want, a quick affair with a nearby bird. And these extra pair copulations frequently produce offspring. Now, that may mean that the birds are raising offspring from a nest that are not, in fact, their offspring. But these extra pair copulations are important for promoting genetic diversity, and they also help an individual bird to guard against losing all of their offspring if something happens and the nest that they are taking care of fails. As I've mentioned, most of our vocalizations that are done in a territory are for guarding your territory. And territorial males will sing from the moment the breeding season starts, and they've set up their territory through nesting, through raising their offspring. They will first sing to attract mates and to defend their territory. And then they will continue singing at local males. This is my area. Don't you come here. Or sometimes the females will sing back at the males as they're in the same area. Females, though, tend to rarely sing. Almost all singing done by sparrows is done by the males. The types of songs range from just strings of notes to chip notes to complicated songs. And we find that sometimes there will be singing competitions where you will hear a number of males singing at each other. In some occasions, that is a male coming in to try to take over the territory of another male. He sees a territory he would like, so he will do a lot of singing in order to kind of push the other male out. We find that if you're finding a bird that is singing in flight, then it may be a grassland species of sparrows. Those that fly in flight tend to be more of the grassland types. The edge habitat ones don't tend to sing as much during flight. Now, the size of a repertoire for these birds, so how many different types of songs that they know, will vary by species, and not surprisingly, song sparrows have a relatively large repertoire. Along with songs and vocalizations that are about territories, there are also non-song vocalizations done by these birds. Those include alarm calls, and alarm calls tend to seem to be rather generic amongst the songbirds. That if a sparrow sings out an alarm call, there's a chance that the cardinals, the finches, the kinglets, and other birds nearby may understand that there's something wrong and heed the same alarm as the other sparrows would. There are also family calls that the family groups will make to each other, where the males, the females, and the offspring will communicate through that. The most interesting of these sparrow vocalizations is done by the towhees. They perform something called a squeal duet, which sounds a lot like what its name sounds like. The male and the female both sing a jumble of notes at the same time. And it doesn't really seem like there's a pattern to it as far as we can tell. The reason they do it appears to be because it helps them in establishing and maintaining their pair bond. So the bond that keeps the two of them together in a pair is in fact maintained by song. And once they have a good, strong bond, they will start singing this to each other to let one know where the other is in the territory. And when they've been separated for any length of time, they will sing a variation of it as they find each other again. So if they come to switch nest duties, there will be some singing. If they find each other as they're out foraging for food, there will be some singing, and so forth. Sparrow nests, as I mentioned multiple slides ago, tend to be on the ground or in a shrub, at the base of a shrub, base of a grass clump, and they tend to not be more than about 3 to 4 feet off of the ground. So they tend to nest on the ground surface or within 3 to 4 feet of the ground surface. Um, they will nest a little bit higher than that at times, specifically if we give them a good bird nest or a good birdhouse to nest inside of. Their nests are open cup nests made of grasses, weed stems, non-woody vegetation, so grasses and vines and things like that. They will then line it with fine roots, grasses, and any animal hairs that they can find. It takes them about 2 to 12 days to build that nest, and they will weave the pieces together in order to create it. So they're not just stacking the pieces, they're actually weaving them together as they build it. There are a few species that will dome an area of grass or kind of pull grasses to cover the opening of their nest. This will take more time and more investment, but that grass that is then guarding the opening serves as a guard for the nest. It makes their nest entrance, and perhaps their nest at all, difficult to find, so predators and rivals will not be able to enter the nest. Nests are rarely ever reused by sparrows, and what we find is that even the same pair is not likely to reuse a nest. They are very likely to come back and reuse the same location, but not the same nest. They will revise it, though, or rebuild it. They may take it apart and then sort through it and reuse certain portions of their old nesting materials. I don't know if any of you have ever seen sparrows do this. I've seen them do this on many occasions, where they will actually take what is in the birdhouse, in my front yard, on my front porch, out of the birdhouse. They will sort through it on my porch, on the sidewalk, and figure out which pieces they then want to reuse. They root through it, they leave some things, they bring some new things, and they're suddenly constructing a new nest. I think what shocked me is that they may come back to the pile that they left behind a couple days later and go through and go, oh, I couldn't find exactly what I wanted. I need more rest of this that I can continue to use. So they'll want to reconstruct a new nest, but they have no problem reusing old materials. It's just reusing an entire old nest is something that they will choose to not do. Sparrow eggs can come in a variety of colors: white, bluish, tan. They can be lightly blotched, heavily blotched, so lots of spots, not many spots. The eggs are all elliptical in shape, and they tend to lay about 3 to 5 eggs, occasionally 6 or more, in a single clutch. The females do the incubation, and it takes between 11 and 14 days for the eggs to hatch. When the young are born, they are helpless. We call this altricial. Their eyes are not open, they do not have any down, they are completely naked, and they look nothing like, in fact, a bird. Their legs develop much faster than their wings as they are growing, so they will learn how to be able to perch before they're capable of flying, which is in fact good given their lifestyle as perching birds. It takes about 9 to 12 days for them to develop their feathers and be able to kind of fly if they need to. There's a chance that if the young are disturbed and they are capable of moving, they will move out of the nest prior to being able to fly. And in some occasions, that means that the young will end up on the ground someplace else, and the parents will come to wherever the young are now. They will find them and continue to feed them. So if you find a sparrow baby in your yard that is fully feathered, capable of moving but not yet flying, it is actually not in its best interest to pick it up and put it back in the nest. Not because necessarily the parent won't feed it because it will smell like you, but because the parent likely knows where its offspring is and may have in fact pushed it there to get it away from a predator. So you actually do want to kind of leave them as they are. If you were, however, to have found a bird that was completely helpless and in that altricial state, that is something you would probably want to return to the nest, but it still may not make it. And this picture of eggs here, you may notice that there's 5 eggs in this nest. 4 of them belong to a song sparrow. 1 belongs to a brown-headed cowbird. You might be able to figure out which egg it is. You might not. So those of you who have been wondering, all these cowbirds that you keep talking about, how are they able to hide their eggs? I mean, wouldn't they notice that an egg doesn't look like theirs? Until I mentioned that 1 was a cowbird egg and 4 were song sparrow eggs, had you even considered that one of the eggs in this picture didn't belong to the sparrow? Probably not. So the cowbird eggs are easily hidden amongst other bird eggs, specifically because lots of bird eggs tend to have some variation in their coloration and the amount of blotching that they have on them. So as long as cowbirds find a nest that kind of has somewhat similar looking eggs, they might be able to pass off one of theirs as actually belonging to that nest. And because extra pair copulations are pretty common, in sparrows, there's a chance that that increases their susceptibility to cowbird eggs because, well, they kind of know there's a chance the eggs might not look all identical. Sparrows are kind of adorable as they grow up. There's a number of different stages of sparrow baby on this slide. They are dependent upon their parents even after they fledged for up to 5 more weeks, so another 3 to 5 weeks of time. The young are pretty vulnerable after fledging. They may be able to find food, they may not. They may not know how to do things. One of the things that we have discovered is that the young do not yet know how to forage. So during that time period, they need to learn how to do that from their parents. Another thing that we have discovered that leaves young vulnerable is that young sparrows are not able to discriminate between approaching objects, to be able to know what is a threat and what is not a threat, and sometimes they're not good at determining what's moving towards them and what is standing still. So they are open to threats simply because their inability to tell the difference between different things. For a while after the young leave their parents, they tend to stay together in a flock. We believe this also helps in learning how to forage, and we think it also helps keep them safe from predators, because in a group they're more likely to know when something is wrong than they are potentially to know it on their own. It takes them 5 or more days after fledging to be able to take their first flight. So that's why these birds may be able to leave the nest before they're capable of flying, but be able to walk to a new location. If you check out the baby bird in the middle picture there, he's pretty capable of walking, not capable of flying it. Those wings are still pretty tiny, and they're still covered in those pin feathers, those immature feathers that haven't fully developed into real feathers yet. And when you look at all 3 of these baby birds, you might notice something about their bills. Their mouths have these yellow edges to them, and the younger ones have more yellow around the mouth than does that one older one off on the side by itself. That yellow coloration actually assists the parents in knowing where the baby's mouth is in order to shove food inside of it. So the parents look at the yellow edges and kind of push their head inside, because what the parents are doing is in fact regurgitating their food into their baby's mouths. So they eat things and then regurgitate it into the baby's mouth. Eventually, they might be able to just bring the baby a soft grasshopper, well, after they've removed their legs, or a soft mealworm or something like that, but it takes time for that to happen. Sparrows will migrate, but most tend to be short distance migrators or permanent residents. They may choose to migrate or not to migrate, so they can be facultative in their migration, depending upon food supply. And on years where there's been a bad winter of food supply, they may choose to migrate. They can fly south, maybe they'll fly to the coast, maybe they'll fly to a drier area for the winter. But often they don't appear to migrate, because what happens is that, well, maybe the ones from Maine came down to Pennsylvania, and maybe the ones from Pennsylvania went down to Virginia. So within the same species, they are moving. We just don't notice it because they're being replaced by their more northern counterparts. There is a difference between who goes where for wintering. There is a sex and age difference. Males tend to winter the furthest north possible, because when they return, this is going to give them the best access to the breeding grounds, because there will not be anybody there yet if they wintered north, so they are able to find a territory faster. And it is true that the younger males tend to winter even more north because they may not be as dominant as the older males. They may not be able to find a good territory easily on their own. For conservation, even though the sparrows tend to do well in human-dominated areas, we find that their populations are in fact declining. The Breeding Bird Survey, which was done from 1967 to 1999, found that 17 of the 33 species studied showed significant declines in North American, in all of North America. 6 more showed regional declines, and only 2 of the 33 species studied showed significant increases. We find that many birds have complex patterns of population changes. There's the problem of, okay, well, are they going to migrate this year or not? And, well, am I seeing birds that live here year round, or am I seeing ones that are only here sometimes and then the population shifts? And our concerns about conservation for sparrows frequently have less to do with population decline than they have to do with making sure they have appropriate nesting habitats. Because the primary cause of decline for sparrows is habitat loss. It's not DDT, it's not chemicals, it's not lead shot, it's not invasive species. Their primary reason for decline is habitat loss. There are no sparrow species that are on the U.S. endangered list, and only one who's on the endangered list in Canada. There are 2 subspecies on the U.S. endangered list. 2 are listed as threatened, and 3 are found on state lists, but overall, none are quite endangered, really. The dusky seaside sparrow, however, went extinct in Florida in the 1980s. We tried to manage the dusky seaside sparrow. It is a subspecies of the seaside sparrow. We tried to manage it very well. As a matter of fact, we had it in an area where it was doing well. It was always a small population to begin with, small range, all of those things. When you have a small population with a small range, its odds for going extinct are always going to be high. But we knew how to take care of this bird. We had them living, well, they were living in an area where we were managing the water depth to deal with mosquito population. And by changing the water depth to help deal with the mosquito population, unfortunately, for multiple seasons in a row, they had flooded nests. So when we have flooded out their nests, we've resulted in nest failure for them, and no offspring were found. Within the 1970s, late 1970s, there were only 6 males left that had been identified, and if you know anything about animal breeding, you know that you can't have a species for very long that's made up of 6 males. It's not possible for them to have any natural offspring. The last sighting of a dusky seaside sparrow was in 1980. We'd given these birds a preserved area, and by managing it for mosquito population control, we destroyed it, and by mistake destroyed their population too. It's definitely one of those species that now we look back on it and we use what we learned from that to protect other animals that we are trying to save from extinction. Overall, 18% of the birds on the international watch list are sparrows for this area, 19 species of them. Few populations, though, are really threatened well enough, or largely enough, to make it on a government list. This doesn't, though, mean that they are really safe. But we are having some good things for them, is that by cutting more forests, we're creating more successional habitat, which is good for sparrows. That we're now converting grassland to other types of edge habitats and shrub habitats, and that's good for these birds too. And, well, then there's just the fact that they've done really well adapting to human environments, and that's great. One of the things we haven't been tracking that seems to be a threat to them, though, is cowbird parasitism, and no one is quite sure how to best track this. We also tried to manage the Cape sable seaside sparrow. We used what we had learned from the dusky seaside sparrow, though, to manage this one. This is a severely endangered subspecies. It, in 2014, was listed as a species on the State of the Birds Birdwatch list as a species most in danger of extinction without significant conservative action. These are related to the dusky seaside sparrow. And what we learned from that, we have used to protect the Cape sable seaside sparrow. We are protecting their grassland habitats. They're found in the Everglades and adjacent to the Everglades, and we are working on setting up a preserve to protect them. And the most important thing we're going to do is proper flood management to ensure that we do not flood their nests. The San Clemente sage sparrow is found on San Clemente Island in California. It is only found on San Clemente Island in California. This island does have a problem with feral grazing animals. So feral grazing animals are things, in this instance, sheep, pigs, mule deer, and goats that have been introduced to the island. They were domesticated and allowed to go wild, and that makes them feral, as they've gone from domesticated to wild populations. These grazers keep the grassland habitat pretty low because that's what they eat. And they made it to the islands in the late 1880s. The U.S. Navy took control of the island in 1934, and they started removing some of these feral ungulates, so the sheep, the pigs, the mule deer, the goats, ungulates being hoofed animals. They started removing them in 1973. By 1993, they'd completed the task of removing the feral grazers. By the 1990s, the sage sparrow was pretty common, but, in the 1900s, the sage sparrow was pretty common. But by 1976, it declined to a population of 112 birds. In 1977, it was listed as endangered, but by 1981, the population had increased dramatically to 360. And then something happened because in 1984, it was down to 38. By 1986, it had increased to somewhere between 195 to 280, which those of you going, that sounds crazy, think about how well we sometimes do counting bird species. Larger populations have such been documented in the 1990s and the 2000s. And we believe this bird is recovering, but that's because of a lot of effort on our part. What we hadn't expected is that it was going to have both good and very bad population years, but that is to be expected. For most of our sparrows, little management is done to their wintering grounds because we tend to focus on their breeding grounds when working on how do we take care of them. And wintering grounds are required for all sparrows. The loss of wintering grounds may be more of a problem than the loss of breeding grounds. The last group we're going to do today are the cardinals and their allies, the order Passeriformes, family Cardinalae. The males and the females in this group are quite different, which if you've seen a northern cardinal, female and male, you already know that. These birds tend to be medium-sized to large songbirds. They're found in open habitats and woodland edges, just like the sparrows are. Their bills, like the sparrows, are conical for eating seeds in the winter, and they're found in successional scrub and forest edges to deserts to agricultural areas, as well as your and my backyards and all over campus.
They are part of that New World 9 primary oscine group that these sparrows are part of. And once again, these guys are closely related to the sparrows. We find that they're also closely related to the tanagers. Within the cardinal group, there are several groups, and we tell them apart by their bill size. If they have a large bill, they're called cardinals and grosbeaks. A small bill, they're called buntings. Yes, the same word that we used for some of the sparrows is also used for some of the cardinals. Common names of birds can be confusing, but we are using them in this course because that is what you're going to find your field guide using. That's what's going to be easier for you to use. But there are some places that are going to focus on the scientific names. Genetic work has indicated that their taxonomy is a little complex. There's 3 tanager genera that belong in here. There's some Latin America genera that do not belong in here, but belong with the tanagers, and, well, it's a little messy. So there are things here that don't belong, and then there are things that do belong in here that aren't. And eventually, we may be able to straighten all of that out. There are some subspecies that are common to cardinals, because some species vary considerably in size and plumage colors, both within and among their populations. Northern cardinal, blue grosbeak, yellow grosbeak can each have up to 17 different subspecies. The pain and bunting, they're a lot easier. They have an eastern and a western population that look a little different. The varied buntings in Baja California are very different than the varied buntings everywhere else in their range. The plumage is strongly sexually dimorphic in adults. The males have very bright colors during the breeding season, whereas the females remain always cryptic, meaning they're going to blend in very well with their background. Many of the males do change their plumage colors seasonally, though, to a tamer or a more cryptic color during the winter and a brighter color during spring and summer. And males do not get their adult plumage for their first breeding season, though. It takes them another year to develop that. And during the first year, males can look completely like a female or like an intermediate bird in their coloration. Those first year males are capable of breeding, but are not very likely to be successful because the females won't see them as attractive. And they're also not going to be as successful at gaining a territory. There's also sexual dimorphism in this group, where the males tend to be larger than the females. It's often not much of a difference, but we find that in the dickcissels, the males are 30% larger than the females are. Most of these species, the young birds, will undergo 2 molts after they fledge, as opposed to the 1 that's done in almost all other bird species. They will do their first molt during their first summer and fall as separate ones, instead of doing just 1 molt during that time period. And between these molts, there's not even much of a body color change. So we're not really sure why they have this molting behavior, but they do. For foraging, they eat insects, they eat seeds and grain and fruit. Those that live in the temperate regions eat mainly seeds and grain during the winter and insects and fruit during the summer when breeding. The subtropical and the tropical ones eat insects and fruit all year round. They can actually, the birds in this group, eat flower buds and flower blossoms, and some may actually prefer those during the spring and summer. And the young are fed insects exclusively. The adults in this group tend to forage alone on or near the ground surface. They form flocks in non-breeding seasons, mixed species flocks, sometimes with sparrows or other birds. And they are known to visit bird feeders. One of the things that surprised us is that the birds in this group will also forage at pretty high heights. And when they're doing that, they tend to be taking blossoms, buds, or fruits from plants. These birds are primarily monogamous. There's a couple exceptions to that. The dickcissel is polygynous, and the indigo, lazuli, and painted buddings can be polygynous. In those three groups, it's between 5 to 35% of males that will have additional mates. And overall, we also find that in that group, about 13% of the offspring result from extra pair copulations. So even though they might be monogamous, not entirely true. Both males and females will sing in this group. And in some species, they will go through a song matching behavior, where the male and the female will match each other's song as part of their pair bonding behaviors. Like we saw in the sparrows, eggs have a variety of colors. They can be spotted, they might not be spotted, which makes these birds yet another type of great possibility for cowbirds to exploit. The varied bunting eggs, though, are kind of weird. They have two sets of different colorations. In Arizona, they're lightly spotted. In Texas, they have no spots at all. And they look almost identical to lazuli and the indigo bunting eggs. One of the most remarkable things we learned about cardinal breeding is that the males, and the females for that matter, do not learn their songs in the nest. So while they're there living with the parents in the nest their first year, that's not when they're learning their songs. They learn their songs as they are returning to the breeding ground. And males will actually learn from males on neighboring territories different songs. They'll retain the songs that they learn during that return trip and during that first summer of breeding, which means they may not in fact sing the song at all that their father sang. There are a few species that are non-migratory. Most of these birds, though, are neotropical migrants, meaning they spend their winters up north and they will then return south to the tropics during the summer. They will do what's called a molt migration, where they do not molt their flight feathers on their breeding ground or their wintering ground. Instead, they will migrate part way and then molt while pausing for about a month or so, and then they'll continue to fly on to the wintering area. So migrate, pause for molt, and then continue migrating. The migratory patterns of cardinal group are driven by food availability. And we find that these birds, when they do not migrate but do move slightly due to winter food stores, they can move from place to place during the winter, and they may not always return to the same location. And they are actually known to change location when their habitat is under stress. They will seek out someplace else to find food. For conservation, most of them are in pretty good shape. They most have pretty stable populations. Some are declined in traditional regions, but they may have actually started expanding elsewhere, and that's really, really good. We have found that some of the populations have pretty complex changes, but it's not like they're actually declining much. The dickcissel, though, which is the top pictured bird here, crashed its population in the 1800s, increased during the 1900s, and it is now stable, but at a much lower level than it was in the 1800s. This is because these birds are agricultural pests, and they have fallen victim to many of the pesticides that are used to control other pests as well, because they will consume the insects that are agricultural pests, and while doing that, consume the pesticides. The painted bunting is declining as well. Its main two reasons are habitat loss and cowbird parasitism. We can help with habitat loss, but cowbird parasitism is a lot more difficult for us to assist with helping. The North American Breeding Bird Survey estimated that there was a 3.2% decline from 1966 to 1995, suggesting the population probably declined about 62% during that time period. And because of that, the painted bunting is listed as near threatened on the international red list
of birds that are in, or of animals really, that are in conservation concerns. Here's a list of videos. You will be able to find some information about their breeding and other things here, and about their songs, foraging patterns, and I would ask that you reach out to me with any questions. Thanks so much.